Sweetgrass Valley, Idaho Territory, 1883. That winter killed cattle before it killed hope. A man sits on a porch step with a cold cup of coffee. Two boots stand beside the door. Not kicked off. Set there. Deliberately. He placed them there last night. After 3 days of searching. After he decided to stop. 12 horses. Gone into the storm. 11 years. Vanished in a single night. On the trail below, a rider sits motionless in the tree line, watching the lit window. Not moving closer. Just watching. Then he turns his horse and disappears into the dark without a sound. The man on the porch doesn't know that rider's name yet. He doesn't know what that rider intends to take from him. He doesn't know that tomorrow morning everything changes. Because tomorrow morning he hears hoofbeats coming down the mountain. Not one horse. 12. The boots stood beside the door like a verdict. Not kicked off in the way of a tired man coming home. Set there. Deliberate. The left one slightly ahead of the right, both facing outward as if they might still leave without him. Caleb Hartwell had placed them there before midnight, after he'd pulled them off sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, and he hadn't moved them since. 3 mornings now he'd walked past them in his wool socks and said nothing to himself about what that meant. He told himself it didn't mean anything. The coffee in his hand had gone cold before he'd taken a second sip. The tin cup sat balanced on one knee, and the steam that had risen from it 20 minutes ago was long gone. Would you treat them with kindness? Taken by the same January air that pressed itself flat against the porch boards and worked through the gap up under the front door and made the flame in the lamp on the kitchen table gutter without ever quite dying. Caleb watched the trail below the ranch, the way a man watches something he's already decided isn't going to give him what he wants. He watched it anyway. There wasn't much else to do at that hour, and the light was still too gray and thin for work, and the horses were gone. 12 of them. The whole breeding string he'd spent 11 years selecting, testing, refusing to sell when the arithmetic said sell. Quarter-horse bloodlines out of West Texas stock, crossed careful and intentional. Each animal chosen not just for what it was, but for what it would throw. He knew those horses the way you know the things you've built slowly, with your hands, with your money, with decisions you can't always explain to someone who wasn't there when you made them. He knew the way copper moved when she was warm versus when she was stiff. He knew that the big roan gelding was smarter than the other 3 geldings combined and twice as stubborn, and that this was a virtue. He knew which mares would give you trouble at foaling and which ones would get quiet and do it themselves in the dark before you'd noticed. 3 days ago, the storm came off the Bitterroot range hard and sideways, the kind that didn't announce itself properly, the kind that was already inside the upper pasture before the temperature drop gave you fair warning. By the time Caleb pulled on his coat and got out to the fence line, the horses were already moving, not panicked. Horses in open country don't panic the same way horses in a burning barn panic. They simply go. They follow the pressure, which in a mountain storm means they follow the wind, and the wind that night was pushing north-northeast toward the draws and the timber and the rock faces that cut the second ridge into a maze of narrow corridors and box canyons that a man could ride for 3 days without covering all of. He'd ridden all of them, or near enough to all of them that the difference didn't matter. He'd left before first light each of the 3 mornings and come back after dark each of the 3 nights with nothing but the smell of horse sweat on his coat and the particular kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and doesn't leave when you sleep. The second day he'd found tracks in the snow along the east drainage, enough of them that he'd followed for 4 hours before they scattered at a creek crossing, and he lost the thread entirely. The third day he'd ridden to the Sulphur Creek Fork and back. He'd covered country that would have been impressive for a younger man on fresh legs. His legs were not fresh, and he was not younger, and the horses were not in any of the places he'd looked. He'd come home the 3rd evening and pulled off his boots and set them by the door. That was the whole of it. The light was coming up now in the east, gray going to a pale color that wasn't quite white and wasn't quite yellow. The particular color of Idaho mornings in January, when there's no weather moving and the cold just sits on everything like a hand pressing down. The ponderosa on the ridge to the south stood dark and separate against it. Below the house, the south pasture fence showed its posts in a line, and beyond that the gate with the iron brand plate nailed to the top rail, the double H mark he'd registered at the territorial office in 1872, the same mark on every animal in the breeding string. He'd nailed that plate himself when the fence was new, with a hammer he still had, with a pride he didn't talk about then or since. Caleb heard Del Rourke's horse before he saw him. The iron-gray mare Del favored had a loose shoe on the near front that created a sound like a syncopated extra beat in her walk, and Caleb knew it from 100 yards. He didn't stand. He waited. Del came around the timber at the lower edge of the lane and pushed up to the porch at a walk that was faster than casual but not fast enough to be emergency, and that told Caleb something about the nature of the news before Del's face told him anything. Del stepped down from the mare without tying her. The mare stood. She knew her business. He was wearing his canvas coat over a flannel shirt with the collar turned up, his work hat pulled low against the cold, and he had the look of a man who'd been up early, not by habit, but by necessity. He came up the porch steps without being invited and sat on the top step beside Caleb and looked out at the same empty trail. Caleb had been watching. Preston Coyle was at Birch's store last evening. Del's breath made vapor in the cold, talking loud enough that Nettie Greer heard him from the dry goods counter. What was he saying? He was saying you're done. That the storm took your string and you've got nothing left to sell and nothing left to borrow against, and anyone in the valley who's been on the fence about dealing with him ought to consider that a sign about how things are going. Del paused. He wasn't wrong about the horses. He's not wrong about much, Caleb said. That's what makes him dangerous. Preston Coyle had come to Sweetgrass Valley in the spring of 1000. Would you treat them with kindness? 881 with cash money, and a lawyer, and the kind of confidence that doesn't come from accomplishment, but from the discovery that most people will step aside if you keep walking forward. He'd bought the Patterson spread inside a week of arriving. Paid less than it was worth F2 family. That was tired enough to take less than it was worth. And within 2 seasons he'd made himself the largest single operation in the valley. He didn't do this by being a better rancher than anyone else. He did it by understanding something that most men in the valley were slow to understand, which was that, in a country where everyone's margins are thin, control of inputs is more powerful than control of land. He'd made an arrangement with Amos Birch at the Feed and Supply in Coldwater. The arrangement wasn't written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. Prices for grain and winter feed at Birch's store had climbed steadily since 1881 with justifications that were technically defensible and practically a slow suffocation. You paid more. You went further into your line of credit. Your line of credit was held by Birch. Birch had an arrangement with Coyle. Caleb had borrowed against the next breeding season in the fall, before the storm. $214, drawn against anticipated revenue from the spring foal sales. At the time, it had seemed manageable. The string was healthy. Copper was due to throw a foal by the gray stud he'd paid over the odds for 3 years ago, and what that foal would bring at the Boise sale would more than cover it. The storm had been a fact about the world, and it hadn't asked his opinion. He filed paperwork at the territorial court, Del said. Assessment petition. He wants the county assessor to put a value on the Hartwell place. Caleb turned the cold cup in his hands. That's the first step in a forced sale process. I know what it is. He can't actually move on it until March 15th. That's the note date. He can move on it the morning of March 16th if you don't pay the $214. Del looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. Caleb, you got the money? The cold held its position. Opinion J landed on the fence post nearest the gate and sat there a moment, vivid and wrong-looking against the gray morning, then dropped off and was gone. Not yet, Caleb said. Del nodded and didn't say anything else about it. He stayed until the light was fully up, and then he went, and Caleb listened to the uneven beat of that loose shoe on the frozen ground until it faded out past the timber. He went inside and set the cold cup on the table next to the one he didn't use anymore. That second cup had been June's. He hadn't moved it or put it away or made any deliberate ceremony of keeping it there. Would you treat them with kindness? It was simply still there, on the right side of the table where she'd always sat, in the same place it had been the morning she died, and at some point in the weeks and months after that, moving it had seemed like doing something, and he hadn't been able to decide what that something would mean. So he'd left it, 15 years of not moving it. He poured his coffee cold down the wash basin and stood in the kitchen with the lamp still burning on the table, even though the daylight was now more than sufficient. June Hartwell had come to Sweetgrass Valley as June Pryor, youngest daughter of a farming family out of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who'd gone west by stages and ended up in Idaho Territory in 1000. Would you treat them with kindness? 865 with the particular combination of stubbornness and practicality that the Pryors passed down like a physical trait. She was 20 years old when Caleb met her at a community gathering in Coldwater. Would you treat them with kindness? And she was sitting in the corner of the room reading a newspaper while everyone else danced. Not because she couldn't dance and not because she was disapproving of dancing, but because the kindness, the paper was from Sacramento and was 3 weeks old, and she hadn't read it yet and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd stood next to her for the better part of 15 minutes before he found the beginning of a sentence. Would you treat them with kindness? They were married the following spring, and from the first year she brought something to the ranch that Caleb hadn't known he was missing, which was clarity about what it actually was. Not sentiment, not optimism. Just the ability to look at the ledger without flinching, read the numbers as numbers rather than as evidence of character, and say what they said. Feed costs are running high. The stallion fee we're charging isn't competitive with what the Denner operation gets for inferior stock. If we sell the South Field timber rights, that money buys us 2 more seasons of flexibility. She didn't tell him these things to demonstrate she was smarter than him. She told him because she'd looked at the thing, and that was what was there. He'd thought he understood the ranch before her. He understood it differently after. In 1872, he'd switched from cattle to horses. It was the right decision for reasons that weren't immediately obvious, and that June had seen before he'd fully articulated them. The military was buying. The postal routes were with kindness. Spexchumit Keem Spizmit. The railroad had changed everything about how goods moved, but had changed almost nothing about how people moved in mountain country, and mountain country was what they had. Good horses would have a market for longer than most people were planning for. She'd read the prices out of the Fort Boise supply reports and laid them beside the cattle prices and said, without pressure, here is what the numbers suggest. He'd made the switch. The breeding program took 6 years to become something real. Another 5 to become the thing he'd been building toward. A string of 12 animals that represented the convergence of bloodlines he'd been selecting through 2 generations. The kind of stock that made buyers from out of the valley come to him, rather than the other way around. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd paid too much for a gray stud in 1880, more than the seller asked and more than the cash on hand strictly justified, because he knew what the animal would throw and he was right about it. June had looked at the purchase price in the ledger and looked at him and said, "You're sure?" And he'd said yes, and she'd written it down without another word, because she trusted what he knew about horses, the same way he trusted what she knew about numbers. She was gone by then already. He'd made the purchase a year after she died. He'd been doing the whole thing alone, running the numbers himself, with tools he'd learned from watching her use them, carrying on a conversation in his head with someone who was no longer there to answer. He got good at it, or he got adequate at it, which was different, and which he confused for getting good at it. That was the problem with doing something alone for long enough. You stopped being able to see what you were missing because there was no one standing at a different angle. Caleb put on his coat and his mule-eared boots and walked out to the south pasture fence. The cold grabbed at his hands and he pushed them into his coat pockets and walked the fence line, not because it needed walking right now, but because standing still felt worse. The brand plate on the gate was dark iron, corners blunt with rust at the edges, the double H stamped deep enough to still be clear. He stood at the gate and looked into the empty pasture. 12 horses. Gone into the storm and the dark and the ridge country, and 3 days of riding hadn't brought them back, and at some point a man has to reckon with what the arithmetic actually says, rather than what he wishes it said. The note was $214. He didn't have it. If he sold Cinder, the 4-year-old black stud who was the best thing he'd raised and the foundation of what the next 5 years was supposed to look like, he might have it. Might. The horse market in January wasn't the horse market in April, and distressed sellers got distressed prices. Selling Cinder to pay Coyle felt like cutting off your right hand to win a fistfight. He'd done something close to this before. In the bad summer of 1879, the herd hit by disease and the market hitting a low in the same season, he'd sold down to 4 animals and started over. He'd done it, and he'd survived it, and he'd built back. And the years between then and now had been the years of building something worth the word. But he'd been 38 in 1879. His knees had been different in 1879. The feel you treat them with kindness. The feeling of possibility in your chest, the particular conviction that you can build it back because you've got time and the animal doesn't care how old you are as long as you know what you're doing. That feeling had been different in 1879. He stood at the empty pasture fence for a long time, and the cold worked into his hands in his pockets, and he thought about June and about the numbers, and about Preston Coyle watching his lit windows from the trail last night, and he thought about Del Rourke's face on the porch step this morning, the look of a man delivering news he'd rather not be delivering to a friend he'd rather not see in this position. He heard them before he saw anything. It came up from below the rock face at the lower end of the trail, and at first he thought it was the wind finding a new channel, but the wind had been still for an hour, and this sound was rhythmic and specific, and his body understood it before his mind caught up. Hoofbeats on rock and frozen ground, not one animal, not two, the scattered percussion of a string in motion, each set of hooves landing just slightly out of phase with the others, in a way that made the whole sound like something alive and organized and moving toward him. He was at the gate before he'd decided to move. They came around the curve of the trail below the lower rock face in single file, bunched at the front, where the path narrowed between the granite outcroppings, and he counted them as they cleared the rock and spread out. 1, 2. He was counting automatically, his eyes doing the arithmetic, even as the rest of him hadn't yet processed what was happening. 3, 4, 5. The roan was second from the front. Copper was near the middle. He got to 8, and then something behind the main body of horses made him stop counting and start trying to understand what he was seeing. A woman on a gray mule. Would you treat them with kindness? She rode the way you ride when you've been doing it since before you had to think about it. Back straight but not rigid, one hand on the reins with a lightness that meant the animal was already where she wanted it. The other hand rested on her thigh, fingers loose around a coil of rope, the way you hold something you've used enough times that it's simply part of the hand now. She wore a duster coat the color of creek mud in late summer, a canvas and wool garment that had seen weather from the look of it and wasn't bothered by seeing more. Under it, a skirt of dark wool that she'd hitched and pinned at the waist for the saddle work. Her boots were tall, dark leather, worn at the heel in the way of boots that get used rather than kept. On her head sat a hat that wasn't hers. It was a man's hat, wide-brimmed and battered, sitting low on her ears in a way that said she'd taken it for function and not for fit. Would you treat them with kindness? She brought 12 horses into Caleb Hartwell's front yard and stopped them there the way you stop horses in a yard you've been to before, which she hadn't. He could tell by the way she looked at the house when she first came off the trail, the quick inventory of a person orienting to new ground. He finished counting. 12. All 12. She looked at him. He looked at the horses. He looked at her. He was still holding the gatepost. These yours. Her voice was level and unhurried, and she wasn't asking because she didn't know. She was asking to confirm a fact she'd already worked out, the same way you confirm a direction on a road you've already turned onto. They are. His own voice felt strange in his mouth, like he'd forgotten it was there. Found them in a box canyon up behind the second ridge. The sorrel mare had herself wedged between two rock faces, hind leg caught in a crack. Had to work her out slow. She said this without drama, the way you report conditions on a road you've traveled. That's what took the morning. He walked into the herd. They parted for him, and then closed back around, the familiar smell of them, the heat coming off their bodies in the cold air. He put his hand on Koppenschnick's neck and she turned her head to look at him with the particular expression of a horse that has been somewhere uncomfortable and is glad to be somewhere else and would prefer not to discuss it. Her left hind leg was the one. He could see the swelling from the knee down. "She'll need watching," the woman said. "Leg's not broken, but she worked it against that rock face a good while before I got there. Give her 2-3 days." "How did you know they were mine?" She nodded toward the gate behind him. Brand plate on the post there. Same mark on every animal in this string. Wasn't much of a puzzle. Her name was Maren Cole. Would you treat them with kindness? She was 31 years old, 29 days out of St. Louis, and she told him this the way she told him everything else, plainly, with the assumption that information was useful and didn't need to be dressed up to be received. She'd come west with a group of women organized under the auspices of the Great Plains Land Company, a concern out of Kansas City that arranged transportation and introductions for women seeking new situations in the territories. Would you treat them with kindness? She was not among them for the usual reasons. She hadn't signed to a correspondence with any rancher or farmer. There was no arrangement waiting for her at the end of the road. What was waiting for her was a woman named Della Marsh in Caldwell Wells, who ran a dry goods operation and had written to the company asking if they knew any women who could keep books and weren't afraid of long hours, because she was looking for a working partner, not a clerk. That was what Maren had come for. Not a husband, not a homestead by proxy, a business arrangement between two women with skills and mutual need. She told Caleb this on the porch while she was waiting to see whether he was going to have the presence of mind to tell her she could water her mule, and she told it to him without apology or explanation, the way you state the terms of a situation so both parties understand them. Granite was the mule's name, and Granite suited him. The animal was ugly in the specific way of mules who've earned their ugliness through character rather than bad luck, with the large square head and the knowing horizontal eye of the breed, and the sort of stillness at rest that suggested deep reserves of patience, held in tension with deep reserves of opinion. Maren led him to the water trough without asking where it was, which was on the east side of the barn and not visible from the front yard. Caleb noted that she found it. He put Copper in the small paddock separate from the main group and went over the leg carefully with his hands. Clean break would have shown by now. The mare stepped on it, weight-bearing, which was the important thing. Some heat in the joint. She'd torn something in the soft tissue and probably bruised against the rock face, but the architecture of the leg was intact. Maren had been right about everything she'd said, and she'd said it once and hadn't repeated it. By the time the afternoon light had shifted and the cold was deepening toward the serious chill of evening, it was too late for her to be on the trail toward the Sulphur Creek crossing, and then over the pass toward Caldwell Wells. She knew this, and he knew this, and he knew this, and she didn't make a production of acknowledging it. She asked him, standing by the barn with her hands pushed into the pockets of the duster coat and her head slightly to one side under the too large hat, if there was somewhere the mule could be sheltered for the night. He said the barn had room. She said she'd get him settled then. He went inside and started the stove. The supper he put on the table was what there was, which was salt pork fried in the iron skillet and cornbread from meal he'd been keeping in the tin box on the shelf, and the last half jar of pickled beets he'd put up in the fall and kept for no reason he could clearly identify. He said it out without kindness, and she sat down across commentary, and she sat down across from him and ate everything on her plate without commentary in the other direction, which told him something. Some people made a thing out of eating plain food, especially in a situation where plain food might be expected to be noticed and appreciated aloud. She didn't. They talked about horses for most of the meal. He told her about the breeding program, what he'd been building toward, the bloodline decisions and the logic behind them, the gray stud he'd overpaid for because he knew what the animal would produce. He didn't usually talk about this to anyone with any detail, partly because most people in the valley knew it secondhand and had already formed opinions, and partly because talking about something you've built always carries the risk that the person you're talking to will look at it with eyes that don't see what you see. And he'd learned to find that particular disappointment more wearing than silence. Maren Cole didn't look at it with those eyes. She asked him whether the roan's tendency towards stubbornness was a trait he was selecting against or working with. Would you treat them with kindness? She asked how he was breeding for mountain soundness, specifically versus flat country soundness, which were different problems and which most people who weren't working mountain country didn't think to differentiate. She asked about the Gray Studs Dam, which nobody asked about because buyers cared about sires, and Caleb had always considered that a mistake. You grew up with horses, he said. Not a question. Farm in Champaign County. She moved a piece of cornbread around the plate. Illinois. Horses and mules both. My father picked horses by looking at their eyes first. A pause that was considered rather than vacant. He said the eyes don't lie. He was right. He was right about horses. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not grief exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a complicated ledger. Other things were more variable. He didn't ask her to elaborate, and she didn't. The lamp on the table made a warm, unsteady light between them, and the wind outside had picked up a little. Not storm wind, just the normal evening. Pressure off the mountains, finding its way through the gap where the back door didn't sit entirely flush in its frame. Would you treat them with kindness? Miesel, she said she'd sleep in the barn near Granite if he could spare a blanket, and he said there was a room off the east side of the house that had a stove and a bed and was standing empty if that was acceptable. She looked at him for a moment with the assessing look he was starting to recognize as her default mode for taking in new information, then said that would do. He built a small fire in the east room stove and left her to it. He sat at the kitchen table for a time after the lamp in the east room went out, with the note from Amos Birch flat on the table in front of him, and June's cup on the right side of the table, and the sound of the fire settling in the main stove. $214. March 1st, then March 15th if Coyle's court petition set the new deadline. The numbers arranged themselves in his head the way they always did, and arrived at the same place they always have arrived at. Not enough, not by the date required, not without selling something that would cost him more in the future than it gained him in the present. He'd run a version of this calculation 100 times in the past 3 days. It didn't improve with repetition. He looked at the window. The trail below was dark and still, and then it wasn't entirely still. There was something at the lower edge of the tree line, where the ponderosa thinned before the open ground began. A shape, a horse and rider, standing without moving. At the distance where you could see the lit window of a house and the glow of it against the dark, but you couldn't be seen clearly in return. The rider didn't come any closer. He just stood there in the tree line in the dark and looked at the lit window, and then he turned his horse and went back into Tim the Timber and was gone. Caleb knew the horse. A dark animal, nearly black, the kind of mount that costs more than a working man spends on a horse, because it was chosen for how it looked as much as how it moved. Preston Coyle owned 2 horses, and this was the one he rode when he was making a point. The point, tonight, was that he was watching. Caleb sat for a while longer without moving. He thought about the fact that 12 horses were in the south pasture right now, instead of lost in the ridge country. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about the way Maren Cole had found the water trough without asking, and the way she'd checked Copper's leg with her hands and told him what she found without hedging it. He thought about the question she'd asked about the Gray Studs Dam, which nobody asked. He stood up and folded the paper from Birch and put it under the second cup on the right side of the table. Then he went to bed. It was the first time in 3 nights he went to bed, rather than sitting in the chair beside the stove, until his eyes closed on their own. He wasn't sure what to make of that. He decided, as his eyes closed, that he didn't need to make anything of it yet. Outside in the south pasture, 12 horses stood in the cold and breathed steam into the dark and were exactly where they were supposed to be. He came out of the bedroom before full light, and she was already gone from the east room. not gone from the property. Would you treat them with kindness? The lamp on the east room stove was cold, which meant she'd been up long enough for the fire to die back, and the blanket on the bed was folded with the particular precision of someone who treats other people's things more carefully than their own. The wash basin was dry. She'd cleaned it after herself. Caleb stood in the doorway of the east room for a moment, looking at the folded blanket, and then he went to the kitchen to start the stove, and through the kitchen window he could see a lamp burning in the barn. The coffee was still heating when she came in from the outside. Cold air moved with her through the back door. Her dark wool skirt had a line of frost along the hem from the wet grass between the barn and the house, and she was pulling off her work gloves as she came through, tucking them into the pocket of the duster coat before she hung it on the peg by the door. Under it she wore a blouse of heavy cream-colored cotton with a high collar fastened at the throat, practical and without ornament. She'd been up long enough to have done real work. Her cheeks had the color of someone who'd been moving in cold air, not standing in it. Copper's swelling is down. She said it while moving to the basin to wash her hands. She's putting weight on it evenly. You'll want to keep her in the small paddock another day, but I don't think you'll have trouble from that leg. You checked her this morning. I was already out there for granite. She dried her hands on the cloth hung beside the basin, the brown gelding with the flaxen mane. He's moving better through that left shoulder than yesterday. Whatever he hit in the storm, it's working loose. She'd noticed the gelding yesterday from a window. This morning she'd gone out and confirmed it on the ground. Would you treat them with kindness? Caleb poured the coffee into 2 cups and set them on the table, and she sat down across from him without being invited, which was exactly what the situation called for, and neither of them remarked on it. The sky outside the kitchen window was the particular blue-gray of Idaho mornings when the weather is holding steady, no cloud movement, cold locked in place by its own weight. Maren looked out at the south pasture while she drank her coffee, and Caleb watched her watching the horses without making a point of watching her. Would you treat them with kindness? The 12 animals were moving around the hay he'd pitched out early, shifting and arranging themselves in the loose hierarchy that formed every morning when food was the organizing principle. You've got more in that string than the valley's giving you credit for. She said it to the window rather than to him. The bloodlines are further along than what I'd expect from the prices Del Rourke mentioned you were charging. Caleb put his cup down. Del Rourke mentioned prices. Del Rourke mentioned a fair number of things on the ride over from Bitterroot. He's the kind of man who talks when he thinks he's being helpful. She turned from the window. He's right that you're undercharging. By how much I can't say without knowing what the Coyle operation charges for comparable animals. The mention of Coyle's name sat in the room between them for a moment. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd heard enough from Del on the trail to know the shape of the situation, or at least the outline of it, which was more than most people in the valley who hadn't been told directly. Caleb didn't confirm or deny what she'd inferred. He reached for the pan on the stove and started cutting slices from the cold cornbread on the shelf. There's a second storm coming. She said it while looking at the sky again. The clouds on the western ridge this morning had the kind of density that doesn't move. That's not weather passing through. That's weather settling in. He looked at the western ridge through the window. She was right. Would you treat them with kindness? He knew it the way you know things you've been watching in the same sky for 20 years, and he'd registered the clouds when he'd come out to start the stove but hadn't put language to them. She'd put language to them. You won't make the Sulphur Creek crossing before it hits, he said. I know. She picked up her coffee again. I'm not going to try. I'll need the east room another night. She said it the same way she'd said everything else, with the directness of someone who'd already thought it through and arrived at the only sensible answer and didn't see the value in dressing it up as a question when it wasn't really a question. Caleb said nothing. She took that as the answer it was. The storm came down from the Bitterroot Range in the early afternoon, faster than either of them had expected. The kind of winter weather that doesn't announce itself with wind first, but arrives almost silently with a thickening of the air and a dimming of the light that you notice before you can name what's changed. By the time the first serious snow was falling, Maren had already moved granite to the interior stall. and banked the small stove in the east room against the night's temperature, and she'd done both without being asked or telling Caleb she'd done them. He discovered them when he went to check the stove himself, and found it already burning clean and even, banked with exactly the right amount of wood for a night that cold. He stood in the east room doorway for a moment looking at the stove. Then he went back to the kitchen. She found the crack in the mortar around the kitchen stovepipe on the second morning. He'd known it was there. It was on his list of things to attend to before it became a serious problem, which meant it had been on his list since October, and it was now January. She pointed at it during breakfast without preamble. That joint is separating. You'll want to fix it before the cold season's done, or you'll be drawing smoke back into the room. He said he had the materials in the work shed. She asked him what he was using for the mix, and whether he'd considered a different aggregate ratio for the join where the pipe met the brick, because she'd watched a man in Champaign County make the same repair twice in 2 winters by using the wrong ratio, and the second time the stovepipe had to come out entirely. Caleb told them with kindness. Caleb told her what he used. She listened to the answer the way she listened to most things, with the focused stillness of someone sorting information into the place it belonged, rather than just receiving it and letting it sit. She watched him make the repair that afternoon. She asked one question during the work, and then didn't speak again until it was done. When it was done, she looked at the joint and said it would hold, in the tone of someone confirming a result rather than offering praise, and went back to the kitchen to start the evening meal. She'd found the ham in the cold box the first morning. It was in the back corner where Caleb had pushed it when he'd put up the winter stores in November, and then largely forgotten about it in the way you forget about things that aren't the immediate crisis. She sliced it thin and fried it alongside eggs from the 3 hens, and made biscuits from flour she'd found in the tin on the shelf. Would you treat them with kindness? And she did all of this with the systematic efficiency of someone who's spent years making good meals in kitchens that weren't adequately stocked for good meals. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the best breakfast Caleb had eaten in the better part of a year, and he ate it without making a production of saying so, which seemed to be the right approach because she ate without making a production of having made it. The second afternoon, would you treat them with kindness? He came in from checking the fence line along the upper pasture and found the kitchen door moving cleanly in its frame for the first time in 2 winters. The door had been dragging on the sills since the timber swelled in the damp of the previous spring, and he'd planed it twice, and it had swollen back both times, and he'd eventually begun leaving it as it was, which meant wrestling it slightly every time he came and went. She hadn't mentioned she was going to fix it. She'd simply found the plane in the work shed, identified the cause, and corrected it. The brass hinges were oiled and moving freely. The door sat level. He opened and closed it twice. She was at the stove and didn't look up. He took off his coat and hat and sat down at the table, and the door hung perfect in its frame behind him. Would you treat them with kindness? The storm had eased, but the temperature had dropped further. The kind of cold that follows a heavy snow when the sky clears, and there's no insulation left between the ground and whatever the night is holding. They were on opposite sides of the kitchen stove. Maren with the history of Idaho territory she'd found on his shelf 2 days ago, and read entirely. Caleb with a section of bridle strap he was resewing where the stitching had pulled. The lamp between them made a circle of warmth that the cold outside pressed against from every direction. She had the book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was looking at the page, but her eyes weren't moving. Would you treat them with kindness? Caleb was aware of this in the peripheral way you're aware of things in a room you're sharing with someone, not attention exactly. More like the background monitoring of a person who's learned to notice when the quality of a room changes, she said. The water rights situation in the northern sections of the territory. The way the prior appropriation doctrine got applied here. The ranchers with the older claims have an advantage that can't be purchased, only waited out. How long has your family held the Hartwell water claim? Since 1868. My filing is older than anyone in the valley except old Whitmore at the north end, and he doesn't run stock anymore. She nodded and looked back at the book. Then she said, so the water's not what Coyle is after. He can't get it. He wants the land because it controls the eastern approach to the upper drainage. And if he holds the eastern approach, anyone who wants to move stock from the Sulphur Creek range to the valley floor in summer goes through his property or makes a 2-day detour. Caleb set the bridle strap down. He looked at her. She hadn't looked up from the book. I noticed it on the terrain description in Chapter 4. The geography of the valley makes the Hartwell place a kind of key. Whoever holds it controls a significant amount of movement through the area. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd known this, or he'd known it in the way you know things you've lived with so long they've become part of the furniture of your understanding, unremarked upon because they're always present. Hearing someone else say it plainly, someone who'd read a chapter of a book and mapped it onto what she'd seen from the trail, made it sharp in a way it hadn't been when it was just furniture. He's been patient about it, Caleb said. Patient people are more dangerous than impatient ones. She turned a page. They've usually got more than one path to the same destination. The fire shifted in the stove and settled. The wind outside had dropped to nothing, which meant the temperature was dropping faster. Caleb picked up the bridle strap and then put it down again without resuming the work. "What brought you out of Illinois?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, not because the question was unwelcome, but because she was actually considering the answer, which he was beginning to understand was simply how she operated. She didn't produce answers before she had them. "My mother died in with kindness. Mother died in the spring of '81. Her voice was even and factual, not the tone of someone describing something they've gotten over, but the tone of someone describing something they've made an accurate peace with. We'd kept the farm going through her illness, but the debts from her care and the bad season in '80 had compounded. After she passed, the decision to sell wasn't really a decision. It was just the conclusion of the arithmetic." A pause. "I went to St. Louis. Found work keeping books for a freight forwarding operation, men who ran a wagon and mule service across 3 counties. I was good at the work. But there came a morning when I sat down at my desk and realized I couldn't remember what the morning before had looked like, or the morning before that. Not because anything had happened to my memory. Would you treat them with kindness? Because nothing had happened to distinguish one morning from the next." She looked at the fire rather than the page she wasn't reading. "I understood then that I was building a life that would be exactly the same on the last day as it was on the first. And I would be the only one who knew that, and I would know it too well." Caleb looked at the stove. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He thought about the East Room, which had been empty for 15 years, which he'd walked past the door of every morning and every evening, and which he'd stopped registering as a presence the way you stop registering the sound of a clock. He thought about June's cup on the table. He thought about a version of himself that had made a kind of arithmetic of his own situation, different from Maren's, but not unrelated to it in its function. You counted what you had. You counted what you'd had. You arrived at a conclusion about what was likely. "Tell me about June." Her voice had shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more careful, like someone picking up something fragile, not because they expect it to break, but because they understand its value. He hadn't talked about June to anyone in years, not that anyone had asked, particularly. Del Rourke had known her, known them both, and had the sense to leave the subject alone. Nettie Greer had offered condolences that had been genuine and that had worn smooth with repetitions until they meant less than the gesture behind them. She knew how to look at a thing straight, Caleb said. The ledger, the animals, the decisions we had to make. She didn't panic and she didn't pretend. She'd find what was actually there and she'd say it. He was quiet for a moment. I learned what this place actually was from watching her read the numbers. Before her, I was doing it on nerve and instinct. With her, I was doing it with information. A longer pause. After her, I went back to nerve and instinct and told myself it was the same thing. Maren said nothing immediately. She let the silence do what silence could do when the right things had been said into it. Then, she sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. And you've kept this place 15 years without her. It wasn't meant to console him. It was a statement of fact that she wanted him to hear accurately. He'd carried the ranch alone for 15 years through 2 bad periods and the long middle stretch where bad hadn't been the problem. Just the ordinary grinding difficulty of doing by yourself what had been designed for two people, and the distance between surviving that and considering it an accomplishment was at it since he hadn't managed to close on his own. Maren had closed it for him in 9 words, not because she was trying to make him feel better, but because that was what the facts said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked back at her book and he picked up the bridle strap and resumed the stitching in the fire in the stove, settled into the steady burn of a fire that will last through the night. The 4th morning the sky was white and still, and the temperature was the coldest it had been. She came to breakfast and looked out at the horses in the south pasture and said, "The gray stud. Cinder, he's your best animal." Yes. What would he bring at the Boise sale in April? He told her. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she was filing information in a place she intended to return to. She didn't ask why he hadn't mentioned Cinder when they'd talked about selling options, because she already knew why. You don't sell the foundation of what you're building to pay for the month you're in. Not if there's another way. She was simply confirming the arithmetic. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the temperature rose slightly, and the sky changed, and the pass over Sulphur Creek would be clear enough to travel by morning. Maren said so at supper, with the accuracy of someone reading a situation rather than hoping one into being. Caleb said she was likely right. Would you treat them with kindness? They ate in the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling like the absence of conversation and started feeling like the presence of something else, though neither of them had named it, and he had no particular intention of naming it first. She was up before him again the 5th morning. He heard her cross the front room while it was still dark, and then heard the back door, and when he rose and dressed and came out, she was already in the barn. When she came back, she said Granite was ready, and Copper's leg was holding, and she'd looked at the trail conditions from the high point above the south fence, and the Sulphur Creek approach was open. She packed her saddlebag with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd developed a system for it and understood why systems mattered when you were traveling alone in country that didn't forgive carelessness. The history of Idaho Territory went back on the shelf. She folded the duster coat over the saddle before she put it on. She took the too large hat from the peg by the door and settled it on her head. At the gate she stopped. She didn't make a performance of it. Would you treat them with kindness? She turned and looked at him with that level look he'd been on the receiving end of for 4 days now. The one that was taking his measure, not because she was suspicious of him, but because she was paying attention, and she paid attention to everything. There's a man at Bitterroot Crossing who runs freight wagons across 3 counties. Her voice was conversational, reporting. He was coming through heading east when I was heading west. He said to be careful about who you owe money to in the northern valleys. Said there was a rancher coming up from Nevada buying debt wherever he could find it and using it to lever people off their land. She looked at him steadily. He said the man was patient and well-funded, and that patience and money together were the combination most people couldn't outlast. Caleb said, "I know who he was describing. I thought you might." She looked at him a moment longer. The morning was bright and still around them, the kind of January day that is beautiful without being kind. If I decide what I think about the situation in Caldwell Wells, and if there's something worth reporting, I might come back through this way. She paused. If that would be useful. He understood what she was offering and what she wasn't offering, which were different things, and he understood that the difference was deliberate and appropriate and that he respected it. It would be useful, he said. She nodded once, put her foot in the stirrup, and went. Would you treat them with kindness? He watched until she was past the Lofa rock face and out of sight. Then he stood at the gate for a while longer, looking at the empty trail the way he'd been looking at it 4 mornings ago, except that the south pasture behind him had 12 horses in it now, and the east room had a folded blanket in it, and the kitchen door swung clean in its frame. He went back to work. The fence line on the lower section had been waiting since October. He pulled on his coat and gathered his tools from the work shed and went out to it. And the work was cold and physical and demanded enough attention to keep the surface of his mind occupied while the rest of it did what it was going to do, whether he supervised it or not. He replaced 4 rotted posts and retightened the wire on 2 sections where the cold had slackened it. Would you tray him with kindness? By midday his hands were stiff and his knees were announcing their objections in the usual way, and he'd covered about a third of what needed doing, which was progress of a kind. He didn't think about Maren Cole while he was working. He thought about her, the way you think about something you're not thinking about, which is to say, she was present at the edge of everything else, without being the subject of anything specifically. The way she'd looked at the horse string and seen what the prices should have been. The way she'd asked about the Grey Studs Dam. The way she'd said June sounds like someone worth knowing, with the particular economy of someone who didn't say more than they meant, and didn't mean less than they said. Del Rourke came by 3 days after Maren had left, ostensibly to return a hay hook he'd borrowed in November, actually to find out what had happened with the woman who'd brought the horses back, because Del was a man who needed information to stay comfortable, and the past several days had given him very little. Caleb told him about Maren in the same plain terms she'd told him about herself, which was the appropriate level of detail for the subject. Del listened, with the focused interest of a man who was hoping the story had a specific kind of ending, and was trying to determine from the telling whether it did. "She's coming back?" Del's inflection made it a question, and also not quite a question. She might come back through on her way to wherever she decides to go. From Caldwell Wells. From Caldwell Wells. Del turned the hay hook over in his hands. "Caleb, I've known you since before June died, and I knew you when June was alive, and I know there's about 8 different ways you might talk yourself out of a thing before it becomes a thing." He looked up. "I'm just observing. I appreciate the observation. I doubt that, but I'm making it anyway." He left the hay hook and went home. And Caleb put the hook in the shed and went back to the fence line, because the lower section wasn't going to repair itself, and March 15th didn't care about anything, except whether the money was there. Would you treat them with kindness? The news about Coyle's assessment petition had traveled through the valley the way all news traveled in a small valley, which was completely and with editorial additions. Nettie Greer came by on the 7th with a jar of preserved plums she said she had too many of, which was her way of arriving with a reason to have come that wasn't the actual reason she'd come. She was a direct woman about most things, but she had her rituals. She sat at the kitchen table and declined coffee because she couldn't stay long, which meant she stayed 40 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? Nettie had seen the original filing at the county courthouse because she had a cousin who worked as a clerk there and who understood that Nettie Greer was a person who needed to know the things there were to know. The petition was drafted by a lawyer out of Boise who'd done work for Coyle before. The assessment would be conducted by the territorial assessor assigned to Clearwater County, who was Coyle's brother-in-law by his first wife. This last piece them with kindness. This last piece of information Nettie delivered with the compressed satisfaction of someone placing the final piece of evidence that makes the whole picture legible. Caleb sat with that for a moment. A controlled assessment conducted by a man who owed Coyle a familial loyalty wasn't technically illegal. It was the kind of thing that was technically quite a few things, and none of them were illegal, which was worse than illegal, because there was no legal remedy for it that could be executed in the time available. "He's covered his angles," Caleb said. "He's covered all of them, I can see. Would you treat them with kindness?" Nettie looked at the second cup on the table, which she'd been looking at every time she'd been in this kitchen for 15 years, and had never mentioned. "You need the money before the 15th, and you need it from somewhere that isn't Cinder. Those are both correct observations. I don't just have $214 sitting in a drawer, Caleb, or I'd put it on this table right now." He looked at her. She was a woman of genuine generosity, and he believed her, and it made the moment harder rather than easier. "I know you would, Nettie." She left the plums and went home, and Caleb sat at the table in the quiet that followed her departure and looked at the arithmetic the way he'd been looking at it. The fence repair he could do himself. The breeding fee adjustment Maren had identified, he could implement immediately, with the clients he had for spring. The grain contract, if he went directly to the Pearson operation down in the valley, could be renegotiated before the next buy. These were all things that helped next year. They didn't help March 15th. On the 9th day he heard Granite. He was in the barn, replacing the worn section of breast strap where it ran over the hame work that required attention and steady hands, and which he'd been doing when he became aware of a sound outside that his body recognized before his mind did, the particular weight and rhythm of a mule's footstep on frozen ground, heavier than a horse's walk, and more deliberate, covering distance without any appearance of urgency. He set the breast strap down and walked to the barn door. Maren Cole came into the yard on granite, at the unhurried pace of someone who has ridden a long distance and is nearly at the end of it. The duster coat had trail dust on the shoulders. Her face had the particular quality of someone who has been in cold air for several days and is past noticing it. She looked at him across the yard with the same level look he'd been the subject of for 4 days 10 days ago, and then she said the store was smaller than the description in the letters. Letters usually run generous on space. The bookkeeping was in serious disorder. 4 hours to see the full shape of it, but the shape was clear enough. Could it be fixed? Straightforward enough, yes. But the woman doesn't want it fixed the way it needs fixing. She wants someone to do the arithmetic without saying what the arithmetic says. Maren brought Granite to a halt and stayed in the saddle a moment longer. I told her what I saw. She didn't appreciate hearing it, but she'll think about it for a few weeks and realize I was right, and by then I'll be somewhere else. Something moved through her expression. Not quite resignation, more like the calm that follows a decision that costs something to make. That's not a partnership. That's being hired to be quiet. She swung down from the saddle. Caleb took Granite's reins when she offered them. Not because Granite needed leading, but because it was the natural thing to do in the moment. I did a great deal of thinking on the ride back. She pushed both hands into her coat pockets and looked at him directly. You need someone, not a hired hand. Someone who can look at what you've got here with a different set of eyes than the ones that have been looking at it for 22 years, and tell you what those eyes see and have you actually hear it. She paused. Would you treat them with kindness? You've been keeping this place alive. That's different from running it. They're different kinds of work, and they take different kinds of attention, and you've been so occupied with the first that you haven't been able to do the second. The cold was particular and still around them. In the south pasture, the 12 horses were visible along the fence line, moving in the way horses move when they're warm and well-fed and unbothered. He said, I've been making it work. I know you have. That's not a criticism. It's an observation about what making it work has cost you. She looked at the pasture, at the horses, at the barn behind him, taking inventory, the way she'd taken inventory of his front yard on the first morning, quick and complete. I kept books for 7 years. I know how to look at a ledger and see what's actually there rather than what you're hoping is there. I know horses, more than I told you the first time, because I was being careful about claiming things before I'd been asked to claim them. A pause. I'm asking now. Or I'm telling you, I'm applying for something that wasn't advertised. The afternoon light was going. In an hour it would be cold enough that the water in the barn bucket would skin over with ice. Caleb held Granite's reins and looked at the woman who'd brought his horses back from the ridge country and fixed his door and read his history book and told him June sounded like someone worth knowing, and he understood that the question she was asking was not as simple as the words it arrived in. There's a great deal about this place you'd need to understand, he said. She looked at him with the particular patience of someone who has already calculated the scope of the problem and found it within their range. Show me, she said. And that was all she said. He brought Granite to the water trough and let him drink. Then he walked Maren Cole into the house and put the ledger on the kitchen table. She sat with the ledger for 3 evenings without asking him a single question. He understood this was not in curiosity. Would you treat them with kindness? She marked pages with slips of paper torn from the edge of the notepad she kept in her coat pocket, and when she reached the end of a section, she would go back to the marked pages and hold them in sequence against each other, reading across entries the way you read a landscape from a high point, looking for the shape of the thing rather than the individual features. She moved the lamp close and kept her pencil in her hand, but rarely wrote anything down. She was building the picture first. The writing would come after the picture was complete. Caleb worked at the other end of the table those 3 evenings, or he sat in the chair beside the stove with whatever needed doing in his hands, And he did not hover, and he did not explain, and he did not apologize for what she was likely finding. The ledger was what it was. He'd kept it faithfully and without flourish. And everything in it was accurate, which meant everything in it was visible, including the places where the arithmetic had been working against him without his full understanding of why. The first evening she read until the lamp needed refilling, and then she said good night and went to the east room, which had become her room in the particular way that things become yours through consistent use and without formal declaration. The second evening, with kindness. She read later, past the point Caleb had gone to bed, and in the morning he found 3 pages of the notepad face down on the ledger, which meant she'd arrived at something but wasn't ready to present it. Would you treat them with kindness? The third evening she closed the ledger at the point where the lamp threw good light on both sides of the table, and she turned the notepad pages over and looked at what she'd written. Then she turned them to face him. She had written 3 things. Each one had numbers beside it, the current figure and the adjusted figure and the difference between them. Annual. Would you treat them with kindness? She walked him through the first one with her pencil, moving under the line of figures while she spoke, and he followed the pencil and heard the words and understood what she was saying as she was saying it, which should have been with kindness, the simple thing, and which had the uncomfortable quality of clarity arriving, where murkiness had lived long enough to feel like the natural state. Would you treat them with kindness? The grain and winter feed costs from Amos Birch's store were running above market by a consistent margin that had been growing gradually since 1881. Would you treat them with kindness? The growth was slow enough that it hadn't triggered alarm in any single season, but across 3 years the cumulative overcharge against what direct contract pricing from the Pearson operation in the lower valley would have cost was substantial. Not catastrophic in a single year. Devastating across time, in the specific way that small consistent losses are more dangerous than large acute ones, because they don't announce themselves as emergencies requiring response. The second item was the breeding fee schedule. He'd set his prices in 1879, when he was rebuilding from the low point, when charging modestly was strategically correct, because he needed clients and goodwill more than he needed margin. He'd never adjusted them. The Coyle operation charged a fee 20% higher for animals whose bloodlines were objectively inferior to the Hartwell string by any standard a knowledgeable buyer would apply, and they'd been charging it for 2 seasons without losing clients. You treat them with kindness. Caleb's clients were paying 1,817 prices in 1,883, not because they'd demanded it, but because he'd never changed what was on the paper. The third item was the 2 mares he'd been planning to sell in the spring as open animals. If he held them through summer and sold them in fall, the net return, even accounting for additional feed costs, was more than double what he'd priced them at in his planning. He'd been about to sell future value at present price, which was not a mistake born of bad judgment, but of the specific tunnel vision that comes from managing an immediate problem and not having a clear line of sight to the longer horizon. Caleb sat with the 3 items for a long time. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them again. He understood each one individually, and he understood them as a group, which was different and worse, because as a group they told a story about what the ranch actually was versus what he'd believed it was, and the distance between those 2 things was years of margin he hadn't captured and debt he'd accumulated to cover shortfalls that shouldn't have existed. Why didn't I see this? He said it to the page rather than to her, the question that wasn't really a question. Would you treat them with kindness? Her answer came without hesitation, which meant she'd formed it before he asked, meant she'd been waiting for him to arrive at the question on his own before she offered the answer. Because you've been fighting to keep the place alive, and fighting to keep something alive, and running it well, are different jobs. They use different parts of your attention. She tapped the page with the pencil. You were so close to the ground that you couldn't see the shape of the ground. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's what happens when survival is the whole job and there's nothing left over for perspective. He looked at her across the lamp. 53 years old, 22 years on this ground, 2 bad periods and 2 recoveries and the long middle stretch. And it had taken a woman he'd met 9 days ago to sit at his table for 3 evenings and see what he hadn't seen in years of looking. Would you treat them with kindness? He wasn't sure whether he should feel grateful or ashamed, and the fact that he couldn't clearly separate those two feelings told him something about how long he'd been carrying the weight of the gap between what he had and what he'd thought he had. Do these 3 things before spring, she said, and this ranch runs a real profit. Not a survival margin. Not if the weather holds and the fall crop is strong. An actual, predictable profit based on what's already here. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at the notepad pages, and then he looked up at her and said the word that had been forming since the evening she'd said, "I'm applying for something that wasn't advertised. Stay." He stopped. He started. Again. I mean, stay in the way that's more than reading my ledger and fixing my door. I'm 53 years old, and I don't know if I remember how to say this correctly, but I'm going to say it, and you can do with it what seems right to you. He looked at her directly. Stay. She didn't answer immediately. This was not evasion. He knew this about her now, that the pause before her answers was never decoration, never discomfort, never the performance of consideration she didn't have. She was actually thinking. She was assembling the honest answer rather than the available answer, which were different things, and only one of them was worth first. I need to go to Caldwell Wells first. She held the pencil between both hands, turning it slowly. Not because I'm uncertain about here. I need to close the door on what I came for, before I can stay where I've decided to stay. I told Delamarche I was coming. I owe her the conversation. A pause. And I need to know whether I can say a true thing to the person I'm working with, and have them hear it even when it's not what they want to hear. I need to test that before I know for certain what I already think I know. She looked at him. If the answer there is what I expect it to be, I'll know the answer here. Caleb nodded. He understood this and respected it, and said so without saying it. She left early the following morning on Granite. The duster coat, dark against the bright cold of the February air, the 2 large hats settled on her ears, the saddlebag packed with the systematic efficiency he'd watched her apply to everything she did. Would you treat them with kindness? She didn't say goodbye in the way of people who aren't sure they're coming back. She said she'd be back through when she had something to report, the phrasing of someone who considered their return a practical matter rather than an emotional one. He watched her take the lower trail until she was past the granite face. Then he went to work. 3 days after Maren left, Preston Coyle came to the Hartwell property with a man Caleb had seen twice before at the territorial courthouse in Coldwater. The second man's name was Gerald Taft, and he was the county assessor for Clearwater County, and he was also Coyle's brother-in-law, a connection that had been made visible by Nettie Greer's information, and that sat in the middle of Caleb's understanding of the situation, like a stone you couldn't dig up and couldn't work around. They came mid-morning, Coyle on his dark horse and Taft on a roan that didn't suit him, both men in coats that were well made for men who'd dressed for a business call rather than ranch work. Coyle's vest under the coat was good wool, his hat was clean. He looked like what he was, which was a man who'd spent enough money to stop having to look like he was spending it. Caleb was at the gate when they came up the lane. He hadn't gone to the gate because he'd heard them coming, though he had. He'd gone to the gate because he'd decided 2 days ago, in the way you decide things when you have time and quiet to think them through, that Coyle was not going to walk onto this property with a county assessor without being met at the boundary. Coyle pulled up short of the gate. He looked at Caleb and he looked at the gate and he understood Caleb the message was without its being spoken, which was one of the things Caleb had reluctantly come to understand about the man. He was not stupid, and he did not require situations to be explained to him. "I'm here as a neighbor," Coyle said. His voice had the particular evenness of a man who'd trained himself out of the tells that impatience and agitation produce. Just wanted Gerald to get a general look at the property. "Informal," Caleb said. "Informal doesn't usually come with a county assessor." Gerald was coming through anyway. Gerald was not coming through anyway. Caleb kept his hands at his sides and his voice at the same register he used to tell men the price of a breeding season. Level and specific and not open to negotiation. "You want a formal assessment. You file with the court, and the court issues the order, and I'll comply with the order because that's the law. Until you've got a court order in your hand, this gate stays where it is." Taft looked at Coyle. Coyle looked at Caleb for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating the variables of a situation that has changed slightly from his expectation. "You've been talking to a lawyer," Coyle said. "I've been reading my rights," Caleb said, "which is something I should have done more carefully 2 years ago." Coyle let a beat pass. Then he said, with the smoothness of a man changing direction without admitting he'd changed it, "The 15th is the 15th, Hartwell. A lawyer doesn't move the calendar." "No," Caleb said. "It doesn't." Coyle turned his horse and Taft turned his, and they went back down the lane without further discussion. Caleb stood at the gate until they were past the timber, and then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface and let the steadiness he'd maintained at the gate dissolve into something that felt closer to the actual situation, which was that he had 21 days and no clear path to $214 that didn't run through Cinda. The ranch was worth saving. He knew this now with a precision he hadn't had before Maren sat at his table with his ledger. The 3 things she'd done with kindness, the 3 things she'd identified were real and they were correctable, and the result of correcting them was a property that would sustain itself and grow over time. But none of that helped him on March 15th. The better future she'd shown him was real, and it was out of reach, which was a particular kind of difficulty, worse in some ways than not knowing the better future existed. He rode to Boise. 3 days on the main trail, the cold pressing from every direction, his good horse moving steady under him, because the animal was sound and well-fed and reliable in the way of things you've cared for consistently. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought during the ride about the calculation involved in what he was attempting. The way the whole situation had a kind of compressed quality to it. Would you treat them with kindness? Too many factors with too little time between them, the sort of arithmetic that didn't resolve cleanly under pressure no matter how many times you ran it. The lawyer's name was James Aldrich, and his office occupied 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of a building near the territorial courthouse in Boise. Would you treat them with kindness? And he was the kind of man whose workspace revealed more about his competence than anything he'd say in the first 10 minutes of a conversation. The papers on his desk were organized with the logic of a person who worked from them regularly and knew where everything was. Would you treat them with kindness? His coat had a permanent ink stain on the left cuff, the mark of someone who wrote things down constantly and didn't arrange their life around appearances. Aldrich read the assessment petition and the original note from Birch and the documentation of the transfer of that note to Coyle, and he read them in sequence and without comment, and when he was done he put them in a careful row on his desk and looked at Caleb. Coyle did this correctly. His voice had the quality of someone delivering information rather than an opinion. The note transfer is legitimate. The petition for assessment is filed within his rights as the note holder. If you don't pay by the 15th, the assessment moves forward, and if Taft conducts the assessment, the assessed value will reflect whatever Coyle needs it to reflect. Caleb said, "Is that legal?" Legal is a complicated word in a situation like this. What Taft will do is give the property the lowest defensible valuation, which will likely exclude or minimize the breeding string's value on the grounds that the string's value is speculative until the spring sales confirm it. The land value alone, without the horses, gives Coyle a number he can work with. So he forces a sale at a number that undervalues what's actually here, and then he buys it at that number, or near it, through a third party that looks independent. Aldrich squared the papers on his desk. It's not unique. I've seen it 3 times in the territory since the assessment laws changed. What stops it? 2 things. You pay the note in full before the 15th, in which case the assessment petition has no grounds. Or you establish that the original lending arrangement involved an improper relationship between Birch and Coyle, material to the interest rate and terms, which might give you grounds to challenge the validity of the note itself. Caleb looked at the papers on the desk. The second option takes time I don't have. Correct. The first option requires money you don't have. Do you know a buyer who'd move on a 4-year-old stud by March 10th? Aldrich looked at him for a moment. Is that what you're planning? I'm planning to keep this place. Caleb said it the way you say things you've decided about before the words arrive, without the inflection of uncertainty. I'm working out how. Aldrich gave him 2 names. Buyers out of the Fort Hall area, who moved on good horseflesh when the opportunity was clear. He said what Caleb could reasonably expect from a January sale of an animal that quality, which was less than April, but more than nothing, and might, at the high end, cover the note and leave a thin margin. Might. The word was doing significant work in that sentence. Caleb rode back in 2.5 days because he pushed harder on the return. The night he got back, he went to the barn alone, after dark, with a single lamp, and stood outside Cinder's stall. The black stud put his head over the rail and breathed at Caleb in the way of a well-handled horse that is comfortable with the human that belongs to it. 4 years old, sound as stone in all 4 legs. Would you treat them with kindness? The offspring of decisions Caleb had made over 11 years about which bloodlines to bring together and why. The horse that represented the convergence point of everything he'd been building toward. Sell Cinder and you solved March 15th. You also eliminated the foundation of the next 5 years. He'd done this before. Sold the foundation to survive the immediate. In 1879, he'd sold down to four animals and built back from them over 3 years. And the work of that rebuilding was what stood in the south pasture now. He could do it again. He knew he could, because he'd already done it once. And the first time you do a thing like that, you're operating on belief that it's possible, and the second time you're operating on knowledge. But the knowledge also told him what 3 years of rebuilding felt like. It told him he'd be 56 before he was back where he was now. It told him the knees would be different at 56 than they'd been at 41. Would you treat them with kindness? It told him that the thing Maren had looked at and said was worth something, the 11 years of careful selection that was visible to anyone who knew how to look at a horse, would have to be started again from a smaller base, and time was a resource he was spending, whether he was careful with it or not. Cinder put his muzzle against Caleb's shoulder. Caleb stood still and let the animal's warmth work through his coat. He thought about what Maren had said about Cinder the morning after she'd come back from Caldwell Wells. She'd looked at him across the south fence in the morning light, and she'd said he was the best thing on the property with hesitation or qualification. The way you say a fact you've already confirmed with your own eyes. She'd known it from looking. She'd looked at the whole picture, and she'd seen that Cinder was the center of it. He thought about the letter he'd written to her. After Negrier had come with the plums and the news about Taft, and after he'd spent an evening with the numbers and arrived at the same dead end from every direction, he'd written it straight, the way he'd learned from June that things were worth saying accurately. He'd described the situation as it was: the Coyle petition, the Taft connection, the note amount and the note date, the conversation with Aldrich in Boise, the question of Cinder. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd asked Nettie to see if she could get it to Caldwell Wells through the postal rider, and Nettie had taken the letter with the expression of a woman who'd opinions about the contents and understood that her role was to deliver the envelope rather than the opinions. He put his hand on Cinder's neck and the horse shifted his weight and settled. Outside the barn, the Idaho night was absolute in its cold, the kind of cold that had physical presence, that pushed against the barn walls and found the seams. The lamp threw Caleb's shadow long and broken across the stallboards. He stood there until the lamp started to gutter on its oil, and then he hung it on the hook and walked back to the house. On the table under June's cup was a piece of paper. He'd put it there himself 3 days ago when he'd written it out. Not the letter to Maren, a different document. The 3 items from her notepad, transcribed in his own hand because he'd wanted to have them in front of him, without the mediation of her handwriting, which he was beginning to know the shape of too well to be neutral about. 3 things. Grain contract direct with Pearson. Fee schedule adjusted to market. Mares held through foaling. None of them helped on March 15th. All of them mattered on March 16th and every day after. He sat at the table for a long time with nothing in his hands. He heard the wind pick up outside and work its way around the corner of the house. He heard the south pasture gate move in its latch the way it moved when the pressure changed. the small specific sound of iron on iron that he'd heard 10,000 times, and that was part of the texture of this place. In the same way, the smell of the cold room, and the sound of the stove, and the quality of light through the south window in the afternoon were part of it. He'd built this into himself over 22 years. It was not simply property. It was the accumulated evidence of what he'd done with the time he'd had and the material he'd been given. Would you treat them with kindness? And he'd made it into something, and June had been right to believe he could, and he'd been right to keep it when the arithmetic said stop, and he was not going to let Preston Coyle from Nevada take it for $214 because Coyle understood that most men could not outlast patience and money together. Nettie Greer came by the following afternoon with a jar of apple butter. She said she'd put up too much of. She sat at the table and declined coffee, and this time stayed 35 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd heard from her courthouse cousin that Coyle had filed a motion to accelerate the assessment timeline on the grounds of property deterioration risk, which was a legal fiction thin enough to read through, but which a sympathetic court might allow. The motion would be heard in 3 days. If allowed, the assessment date moved up by a week, which would push the pressure on the payment deadline earlier than the original note terms technically required. Caleb looked at the window. He's adjusting the timeline because I met him at the gate. That's my read. Nettie looked at the second cup on the table and then at him with the directness of a woman who was going to say something and had decided to stop being indirect about deciding it. The woman who came back through here. Maren Cole. I got a letter last week from Caldwell Wells through the postal circuit. From her. She set an envelope on the table. She asked me to get it to you. She knew I would know you, and she knew you would know me, which tells you something about how much attention she paid to what people said when they talked. He looked at the envelope. His name was written on the front in a hand he recognized from 3 evenings of watching it move across notepad pages. Nettie stood up and put her coat back on and said she'd see herself out, which was her way of giving him the room. He opened the letter after the front door closed. She'd written it in the same plain style she spoke in, no preamble, no decoration. She said she'd read his letter twice and understood the full situation. She said, the assessment acceleration motion told her that Coyle was a man who adjusted when his first approach met resistance, which meant he was dangerous in a sustained way rather than just an immediate way, and Caleb should operate with that understanding. She said she was on her way back. She said she was on her, that her timeline would put her at the Hartwell property 8 days before the original note date. She said she had something to discuss that was better said in person. She said nothing else about what that something was. Caleb folded the letter and held it for a moment and then put it in his vest pocket. He got up and poured himself coffee that was still warm from the morning and looking out at the south pasture where the breeding string moved against the white of the remaining snow. Cinder was near the fence at the east side, the black of him clean and distinct against everything else. 8 days. 8 days was 8 days before the note date. It was enough time for very little and also for everything. Would you treat them? Depending on what Maren Cole had in her saddlebag that was better said in person than written in a letter. He finished the coffee and went out to the barn to feed. The cold was sharp and honest, and it asked nothing of him, except that he moved through it, which he did, pulling on his work gloves as he walked, the familiar weight of the barn in winter ahead of him, the horses alert to his approach in their individual ways, the sounds and smells of the place that he'd built into himself, so thoroughly he wouldn't have been able to separate them from the fact of being alive if he'd tried. He fed and watered and checked each animal in turn, and he did it with the care of someone who understood that the value of the thing he was protecting was not primarily in the dollars it represented, but in what those dollars were evidence of. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was 11 years of correct decisions made by a man who knew what he was doing and kept doing it when the surrounding circumstances argued against continuing. That was the word the valley had landed on for him, apparently, when they were being charitable. Stubborn. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd heard it said as a description of his difficulty, and he'd heard it said as a description of his longevity, and the difference between those two uses was entirely a matter of whether the thing you were being stubborn about turned out to be worth it. He didn't know yet whether it would turn out. He knew that 8 days was 8 days, and that whatever Maren had in her saddlebag, that was better said in person, it was either enough or it wasn't, and the morning she rode into the yard would tell him which. He finished in the barn and went back to the house, and put more wood in the stove and sat at the table with the 3 items written in his own hand, and he did not move June's cup from the right side the boots by the door, and he did not look at them on that morning when he rode out to check the upper pasture fence, and he intended to put them on again tomorrow, and every day after, and that was already the answer to the question he hadn't known he was being asked when he'd placed them there 9 days ago. She came in on the 8th day exactly, and Caleb was at the south fence when he heard Granite on the trail below. He didn't drop the fence tool. He finished them with kindness. Finished checking the post he'd been checking, because the post needed it and because he'd learned something about himself in the weeks since January that he hadn't known before, which was that the impulse to abandon what he was doing and run toward what he wanted had never served him particularly well, and the things that were real could wait 4 minutes without becoming less real. He set the tool against the post and walked back to the yard at his ordinary pace, and she was already there. Granite, treat them with kindness. Granite stood at the water trough, drinking with the focused dedication of an animal that has covered serious ground and intends to make the most of the stop. Maren was at his head, one hand resting on the mule's neck, watching the animal drink the way she watched everything that mattered to her. Would you treat them with kindness, with the patient attention of someone who understands that hurrying a tired animal at a water trough is a way of telling it you care more about your schedule than its condition? She'd removed the too large hat. Her dark hair was pinned back but loosely, strands working free at the temples from the wind of the trail. Would you treat them with kindness? The duster coat the dust of the lower road where the snow had thinned and the ground was dry again. She looked at him when he came through the gate. He looked at her. The February with kindness. The February light was pale and clean between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment because neither of them needed to manufacture a beginning. They'd been in the middle of something since January, and both of them knew it. Della Marsh's operation, Maren said, is not what her letters described. Letters tend to be generous about the parts that matter most. The accounts are in serious 4 hours with the ledger to see the complete picture. But the picture was clear enough once I had it. She owes 2 suppliers. She owes 2 suppliers who patience longer than patience usually lasts because they like her, and because they're afraid the business will fail without her, which is probably true. Maren's voice had the quality it always had when she was reporting, rather than editorializing, level and specific, like someone reading coordinates from a map. I could fix the books. I cannot fix the part where she doesn't want to hear what the books say. We talked for most of a day, and she listened to approximately none of it. She understood and didn't want to. That's exactly right. There's a difference between not understanding and not wanting to, and she's sharp enough that it's clearly the second. Granite finished at the trough and shifted his weight and stood in the settled way of a mule that has done its work and is content to be still. Maren kept her hand on his neck. I told her what I saw. She was not glad to hear it, but she'll think about it over the next month and realize I was right, and she'll find a way forward that suits her. She has more options than she's currently willing to look at. A pause that was simply a pause, not a hesitation. It is not a partnership. She wants someone to do the arithmetic and not speak the conclusions aloud, and that is not something I am able to do. Would you treat them with kindness? I know it in the specific sense of having understood this about her since the 3rd evening she'd sat at his table with his ledger. She reached into the inner pocket of the duster coat and brought out a tin, the flat rectangular kind sold at general stores for carrying valuables on the trail. She held it out to him. He took it. It was heavier than its size prepared him for. Open it, she said. The tin held currency and coin wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a leather strip, assembled with the organized density of someone who had packed it to travel safely and take up minimum space. He looked at what was in the tin, and then he looked at her, and the February afternoon held itself still around them. $230. She said it without inflection, designed to produce a specific response. Just the number, just the fact. 7 years of keeping books for men who paid on time, living in a rooming house where my expenses were fixed and the money had nowhere useful to go. I kept it in that tin under the floor of my room because I learned early that a woman traveling alone needs to be able to move without depending on anyone else's timing or generosity. She looked at him directly. I am not giving this to you. I am investing it, with written terms signed by both of us. You pay Preston Coyle $214 before March 15th and you get a receipt with his signature, acknowledging the note is satisfied in full. You implement the 3 items from my notepad before the spring buying season opens. In return, I receive a documented percentage of the net operating profit from this ranch for the following 2 years, at which point we sit down with the ledger and renegotiate based on what the numbers actually show. Caleb held the tin with both hands. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about what it meant that this woman had carried this money under the floor of a rooming house in St. Louis for 7 years, against the possibility of needing to move fast, and had chosen instead to take it out and put it in his hands on a February afternoon in Idaho. He thought about the 3 evenings at his kitchen table. He thought about Granite finding the water trough without being shown. You planned this from Caldwell Wells, he said. I planned it from the moment I read your letter. She held his gaze with the steadiness she brought to anything she'd decided about. You described the situation honestly. The Taft connection, the accelerated motion, the question of Cinder. I understood what kind of man Coyle is from the way he moved when you met him at the gate. Men who cover their flanks while they're covering the front are not men you outlast by waiting. She paused, and I understood what Cinder means to what you've built here. You don't sell the foundation of the next 5 years to pay for the month you're in. Not when there's another way. He closed the tin carefully. He held it a moment longer. We write the terms tonight, he said. Something settled in her expression. Not relief, because she hadn't been afraid he'd refuse. The quiet confirmation of a calculation that had come out correctly. Tonight, she said. He rode to Boise the next morning, with the tin inside his coat and the written terms folded in his vest pocket. And he was back in 4 days. And on the 11th of March, he sat across a desk from Preston Coyle in James Aldrich's office, with Coyle's lawyer present, and counted out $214 in currency and coin, while Aldrich documented the transaction. And Coyle's lawyer watched with the expression of a man who has been handed a situation he didn't anticipate and is determining how to reframe it. Coyle signed the receipt. His hand was steady and his face was composed, and he said nothing while he signed, which was the version of Preston Coyle that Caleb had always found most instructive, the one that appeared when the man was recalculating rather than reacting. He pushed the receipt across the desk, without looking at Caleb directly. The way you push something across a desk, when you want the action to convey less than it conveys, and Caleb took it and folded it and put it in the same vest pocket as the partnership terms. The assessment petition was withdrawn that afternoon. Aldrich walked Caleb to the street afterward and told him the situation wasn't finished because men with Coyle's particular combination of resources and patience rarely abandoned a position entirely. They retreated to find a different angle, and Caleb should keep his documentation current and his rights clearly maintained. Caleb said he had someone helping him with the documentation now. Aldrich looked at him with the mild interest of a man receiving information he hadn't asked for and finding it more interesting than he'd expected, and then shook his hand and went back upstairs. The hearing at Coldwater came 8 days later. Coyle had filed a motion challenging the validity of the note payment on the grounds that the funds had come from an undisclosed third party with an undocumented interest in the property, which was the move of a man who understood that losing one approach simply meant identifying the next available one. Would you treat them with kindness? The motion required a hearing before Territorial Judge Horace Vann, and the hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the courthouse on the main street of Coldwater, which was a 1-story timber building with 2 rooms and a wood stove that couldn't entirely manage the cold of a February morning in the Idaho foothills. By the time Caleb arrived, there were more people in the courthouse than the room was designed to hold comfortably. Would you treat them with kindness? This was not unusual for Sweetgrass Valley, where a legal proceeding of any consequence drew the community the way a community gathers when something is being decided that everyone will feel the consequences of whether or not they are parties to it. Del Rourke was near the back wall in his canvas coat, with his hat in his hands. Nettie Greer sat in the second row with the posture of a woman who arrived early to situations she considered important. Amos Lattimore stood near the door with two other ranchers from the north section. Men Caleb recognized as recipients of Coyle's letters. Men who had received the same patient pressure that had been applied to the Hartwell place, and who had come to watch how it resolved. Coyle was already seated when Caleb came in, beside his lawyer Grayson from Boise, a man in a good coat who held his papers with the practiced ease of someone who considered courtrooms his natural environment. Coyle wore his usual vest and his clean hat, and he looked at Caleb when Caleb came through the door, with the expression of a man noting the arrival of a variable he has already accounted for. Maren came in behind Caleb. She had put on her better blouse, the heavy cream cotton with the high collar, under the duster coat. The too large hat was in her hands rather than on her head. She walked to the front at kindness. She walked to the front of the room and set the hat on her knee and looked straight ahead with the particular quality of stillness she brought to situations she had already decided how to handle. Judge Horace Van was 60 years old and had been on the territorial bench for 11 of them and had the bid and the patience of a man who has heard most of the available arguments and is interested in the ones he hasn't heard yet. He called the room to order with no particular ceremony and asked Grayson to present the motion. Grayson presented it cleanly. The funds used to satisfy the note had originated with a third party, Miss Maren Cole, who held a documented financial interest in the Hartwell property. Would you treat them with kindness? The payment therefore did not represent a genuine satisfaction of the debt, but rather a transfer of obligation, and the original assessment petition should be reinstated with the new interested party's stake in the property considered as part of the assessment. It was well constructed. Caleb had expected it to be well constructed because Coyle did not retain lawyers who weren't, Aldrich responded. The partnership agreement between Caleb Hartwell and Maren Cole was a legitimate business arrangement, predating the payment, documented and executed in accordance with territorial law, and Miss Cole's funds used for the payment were her personal assets, with no lien or encumbrance attached. The note had been satisfied in full by lawful currency on the date specified. The motion had no standing, Grayson replied. Aldrich countered. Judge Van listened with the expression of a man sorting what was argument from what was law, which pretreat be less, which were different things and which he had long experience distinguishing. Then Coyle leaned toward Grayson and said something quietly, and Grayson stood again and said, "Your Honor, we would submit that the nature of Miss Cole's relationship to the Hartwell property and to Mr. Hartwell personally warrants examination. A woman who arrives from out of territory, with no established standing in this community, inserting herself into a property dispute by providing funds to a man of advanced years in a vulnerable financial position, raises questions that the court should consider before accepting the payment as unencumbered." The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has been said that clarifies what the argument was always actually about. Caleb felt Maren's stillness beside him change in quality, not to agitation, to the stillness of a person who has arrived at a decision point and is executing the decision. She stood. Judge Van looked at her over his papers. "Miss Cole, Your Honor." Her voice was what it always was, level and specific. "I'd like to address the court, if the court will permit it." "Van, you treat them with kindness." Van looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man who has seen many people stand up in his courtroom, and who can usually tell within the first sentence whether they have something worth hearing. "Proceed," he said. "Would you treat them with kindness?" She turned slightly so that she was speaking to Van but also to the room, to the 20 people in that courthouse who were the community that Caleb Hartwell had lived inside for 22 years, and who had been, for the past several months, watching him from the particular distance that a valley keeps from a man it has quietly begun to write off. "I came to Sweetgrass Valley in January of this year," she said. "I found Mr. Hartwell's horses in a box canyon on the second ridge after a storm, and returned them to his property. I stayed because the weather required it, and I stayed longer because I asked to look at his operations accounts and found something worth looking at. She paused. In 3 evenings, with his ledger, I identified 3 adjustments to his operating costs and revenue that, implemented before spring, would put this ranch into genuine profitability. Not speculative profitability, not weather-dependent profitability. Actual, documented, predictable profit, based on assets already present and already producing. The room was very quiet. Nettie Greer was looking at Maren with the expression of a woman watching someone do something she has been waiting for someone to do. I invested my personal savings in this operation because I looked at what was here and I understood its value, Maren continued. 7 years keeping accounts for commercial operations taught me how to read what a business actually is versus what its current circumstances make it appear to be. What this ranch is the product of 11 years of careful, expert decision-making about animal breeding and selection. What its circumstances have been is a man running that operation alone, managing an immediate crisis with the tools available to him, without a second set of eyes on the larger picture. She looked at Van directly. That is not vulnerability. That is the ordinary condition of a single-person operation that has been systematically disadvantaged by inflated by input costs engineered by a competitor who understood that thin margins and the right pressure applied at the right time would eventually produce a forced sale at a price of his choosing. Grayson was on his feet. Your Honor, this is not relevant to the motion before the court. Van held up one hand in Grayson's direction without looking at him. He was looking at Maren. Continue, Miss Cole. I have documentation, she said, of a pricing arrangement between Amos Birch's supply store and Preston Coyle's operation that resulted in feed and grain costs to the Hartwell ranch running above market rate by a consistent and growing margin beginning in 1881. The same year Mr. Coyle arrived in this valley. I have a draft letter in Mr. Coyle, acquired by a member of this community, proposing the same approach to 3 other ranchers in this valley who are present in this room today. She did not look at Lattimore or the other 2 men. She kept her eyes on Van. I am not asking this court to adjudicate those matters today. Would you treat them with kindness? I am asking this court to consider whether a motion filed by the man who engineered those arrangements, challenging a payment that prevented him from completing what those arrangements were designed to accomplish, deserves the standing he's claiming for it. The room was not quiet anymore. It was doing what rooms do when information has arrived that reorganizes what people thought they understood. Coyle's face had not changed. That was the most instructive thing about him in that moment. He treated them with kindness. He sat with his lawyer in the front of the room and his face was composed and his hands were still, and he looked like a man who had already moved to the next calculation, because that was what he was. But the room had changed, and Coyle knew it had changed, and Judge Van knew it had changed, and the 20 people who were the community of Sweetgrass Valley knew it had changed, and that was the thing that couldn't be undone by any motion filed in any court. Judge Van looked at the papers in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked at Grayson. The motion is denied. The payment of record stands. The assessment petition remains withdrawn. He looked over the room with the deliberate attention of a judge who wants the room to understand that what he is about to say is for the room as much as for the parties. Would you treat them with kindness? I will note for the record that the documentation Miss Cole has referenced regarding pricing arrangements and correspondence will be referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review. Mr. Coyle, Mr. Birch, I would recommend you both retain counsel for that conversation. He gathered his papers. We're done here. Coyle stood and buttoned his coat and said something to Grayson in a voice too low to carry. And then he walked out through the room in the same composed silence he'd arrived in, and the room parted for him, and he was gone. Caleb stood beside Maren in the front of the courthouse, and the room moved around them the way rooms move when a verdict has been delivered and people are processing what it means for them specifically. Lattimore came forward and put out his hand, and Caleb took it, and Lattimore said, without elaboration, those letters. I wasn't the only one. Caleb said he knew. Lattimore looked at Maren, and nodded with the respect of a man who has watched someone do something he couldn't have done himself and knows it, and then he went to find the other two ranchers near the door. Del Rourke appeared at Caleb's shoulder with the expression of a man who has been right about something for 2 months and is being restrained about it. He looked at Maren and said, "That was well done." Maren said it needed doing. Del looked at Caleb with kindness. Caleb with the eyes of a man who has known someone long enough to see the difference in them and is not going to say so directly because he doesn't need to. And then he put his hat on and went out into the cold. Nettie Greer embraced Maren at the door with the brief, fierce efficiency of a woman who does not make performances of affection but means it completely when she offers it. She said into Maren's ear, loud enough for Caleb to hear, "You read that room exactly right." Then she looked at Caleb and said, "Don't waste what just happened," and walked to her horse. They rode home in the February cold with the valley spread below them and the Bitterroot Range white against the sky to the north. Would you treat them with kindness? And Caleb rode beside Maren on the wider sections of the trail and thought about the 20 people in that courthouse, and about the community's particular kind of memory, how it kept its accounting of a man across the years, the way a ledger keeps its accounting of a business, and how the accounting, had been revised today in the space of a single morning by a woman who stood up and told the truth clearly in a room full of people who needed to hear it. "Coyle will move again," he said. "Not here and not soon, but somewhere, I know." She was watching the trail with the forward attention of a competent rider. Men like that don't stop. They reassess. A pause. But he's done here. The room saw what it saw. You can't undo a room. Preston Coyle sold his valley property in May, quietly, to a land company out of Denver. He did not announce his departure or explain it. One morning his horses were gone from the pasture on the hill, and a week later a man from Denver came through Coldwater, asking about hay suppliers, and that was how the valley understood that the chapter had closed. Nettie Greer summarized it over preserved plums at Caleb's kitchen table. A man who is only powerful when others are weak doesn't last long in a place where people start comparing notes. Spring came into the valley the way it came every year, not all at once but in argument, with the cold one warm week, and then a hard frost, and then a week of mud, and then suddenly the willows at the creek showing green at the tips and the meadowlarks back on the fence posts, and the horses in the south pasture moving differently, looser. The particular ease of animals that have come through the worst of the season and know it. The grain contract with the Pearson operation came through in March. The new breeding fee with kindness. The new breeding fee schedule went into effect without announcement or explanation, simply as the number on the paper when clients came to discuss spring arrangements, and not one of them objected, because the horses in the south pasture were visibly what they were, and people who know horses pay for horses rather than for how you describe them. Maren began the foaling register in April, a systematic record of condition assessments and developmental notes on each animal that would become, over the coming seasons, the kind of documentation that made buyers from outside the valley drive an extra day to get here. Would you treat them with kindness? They married in June on a Tuesday because the preacher from the West Road Church could come on a Tuesday, and because neither of them had any strong feeling about which day of the week a thing became true. The kitchen was the right room for it. It was where the actual work of the ranch and of what they were to each other had taken shape, across a kitchen table with a ledger and a lamp between them, and it seemed false to go somewhere else and then come back. Would you treat them with kindness? The preacher said the necessary words with the straightforward warmth of a man who genuinely believes in what he's doing without requiring the ceremony to be larger than it needs to be. Del Rourke stood in the back of the kitchen in his best flannel shirt, with his hat in both hands, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been right about something since February and has the grace not to say so. Nettie Greer arrived an hour before anyone else, and arranged the table with food she'd brought in a covered basket, and when Maren came out from the east room, Nettie looked at her and said simply, "Good," in the tone of a woman confirming a long-standing opinion. Amos Lattimore brought a bottle of something decent from the east and set it on the counter and talked about the spring foal, crop, and the likelihood of a dry summer, which was what ranchers talked about when they were happy and wanted to be present without making a scene of it. Maren wore a dress she'd made from cloth, the color of Idaho sky in late August, a blue that was dark enough to be serious and warm enough to be something other than just serious. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd ordered the cloth in February. Caleb learned afterward, before anything between them had been named as anything other than a business arrangement. She told him this on the evening of the wedding when he asked about the dress. She said she'd decided before she'd said anything, because she needed her decision to be fully her own before she offered it to anyone else, and once she'd decided, she saw no reason to wait on the practical expression of it. He sat with this for some time. Would you treat them with kindness? There was something in it about the nature of being chosen by a person who had taken the full measure of what they were choosing, who had looked at the ledger and the debts and the bad knees and the 15 years of silence and the 2 full back room, and had gone ahead and ordered blue cloth. Something that didn't them with kindness. Something that didn't make him feel diminished by the choosing, but rather the opposite, as though the choosing, because it had been deliberate and clear-eyed and without illusion, meant more than the kind of choosing that happens before you know what you're choosing. He didn't have words for this that were adequate. He didn't need words for it. Would you treat them with kindness? She was standing beside him at the kitchen window in her blue dress in the long summer evening light, and the south pasture was green, and the horses were moving in it, and that was what the thing felt like, and the feeling was sufficient. Copper fold on a morning in the last week of April, when the frost was still on the ground at first light, but the sky to the east had the quality of a sky that is genuinely warming, rather than performing warmth. Would you treat them with kindness? She was a first-time dam, and she'd been restless for 2 days with the particular restlessness of an animal that doesn't know yet what its body is doing but is paying close attention to it, and Caleb had been going out every hour through the night to check her. At 3 in the morning, Maren was already in the barn when he got there. She hadn't been asked. She'd heard the shift in Copper's sounds through whatever part of her sleep stayed tuned to the barn, and she'd dressed and come out with the lamp and was standing at the stall rail when Caleb arrived with his own lamp and found her there. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at him with the simple acknowledgement of 2 people who have arrived at the same place for the same reason, and then she looked back at the mare. They stayed. Would you treat them with kindness? The labor was long and effortful, and Copper was uncertain through the middle of it. The first-time uncertainty of an animal doing something its body knows but its experience doesn't, and Maren stayed at the mare's head through the worst of it, her voice low and continuous, and without the false comfort of words, just the sound of a human presence that was not alarmed, which was what the animal needed and what Maren understood without being told.
Caleb worked
Worked at the other end when the labor needed managing and held back when it didn't, and the 2 of them moved around each other and around the mare with the logic of people who have gotten good at sharing a space, who have learned each other's rhythms well enough to know when to move and when to be still. The foal treat them with kindness came at first light, at the moment when the darkness in the barn was becoming something other than darkness, without yet being full light. That particular threshold of morning that lasts only a few minutes and that Caleb had always found, in his many years of nights in this barn, to be the most honest part of the day. Red like the mother. 1 white sock on the left front leg. The foal treat them with kindness. Lay still for the 10 seconds that always feel longer than 10 seconds, and then its head came up and it announced itself to the world with the conviction of something that has decided to be alive. And Copper turned and did what mares do, and the barn filled with the sounds and smells of a new thing in it. Caleb and Maren stood shoulder to shoulder at the stall rail and watched the foal find its legs, which took the time it always takes, and which remained, after 30 years of watching it, something that could hold his full attention. The lamp was still burning on its hook above them. The cold of the April morning was present but not severe. Outside the barn, the first birds had begun, a meadowlark somewhere on the fence line doing what meadowlarks do at first light, regardless of whether anyone is listening. He was aware at some point that he had stopped watching the foal and was simply standing in the warm lamplight with his shoulder against her shoulder, and the quality of that contact, the specific warmth of another person present without any need for management or explanation. Would you treat them with kindness was thing he had spent several years carefully not wanting, because not wanting it had been easier than wanting it and not having it. He was aware that he had been wrong to do that. Not wrong in the sense of a mistake that could have been avoided. Wrong in the sense of a conclusion that had seemed like accuracy, and had in fact been something smaller than accuracy. The conclusion of a man who had survived so much difficulty alone that he had confused the absence of help with the proof that help was not available. He reached up and brushed away a piece of straw that had caught on her cheek. A simple thing, a 4-second thing, and she didn't move away from it. She turned and looked at him with the eyes she used for things she'd decided to actually see rather than just register, and the lamp made its warm light between them. "You all right?" Her voice was quiet. "Yes," he said. "I'm all right." He looked back at the foal, which had achieved a standing position of sorts and was conducting a focused investigation of its own legs. "He's going to be the best one." "I know," she said. "I've known since February." And the thing about that was that it was not only about the foal, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. They named him Flint, because Maren said he'd come out of stone, and the name fit, and because the naming of horses was something she'd told him in January that she believed in, and Caleb had found, by April, that he believed in it too. By October, the ledger told a different story than it had ever told. Caleb sat at the desk on an evening in the middle of the month with the lamp burning and the stove warm and the sound of the horses in the pasture coming through the window as a texture of the night, and he read the year's accounting from beginning to end and then sat with it for a while. He found Maren in the barn. She was at Copper's stall, which was where she often was. In the evening, the relationship between her and that mare having become the specific thing it became between an animal and the person who was present at its worst moment, and stayed until the worst moment passed. Copper turned toward her when she came into the barn in the way she didn't turn toward anyone else. Caleb came and stood beside her at the rail. "I read the books," he said. "The whole year. What it actually did." She waited. "You were right about all 3 items. The grain contract, the fee schedule, the mares held through foaling. Every number landed where you said it would land." He was quiet for a moment. "We turned a real profit. Not a margin that depends on next spring. An actual profit now, by the numbers as they currently are." She looked at Copper rather than at him, which was not avoidance, but simply the way she received information that confirmed what she already knew, without the need to make a production of the confirmation. "The numbers were always there," she said. "They just needed to be read from a different angle." 22 years, he said, "and I have never had a year that looked like this one. Would you treat them with kindness?" She turned then and looked at him directly in the lamplight with the warm quality that had appeared in her eyes sometime in the months since the wedding, and that was not a new quality exactly. More like a version of her habitual directness that had stopped needing to be only professional. "You did most of the right things for a long time," she said. "You just needed the rest of the picture." He looked at her in the barn lamp's light and thought about the particular fact of her, this woman who had followed the sound of trapped horses into a box canyon in January cold, and spent a morning working a leg free from a rock crack, and then brought 12 animals down a mountain and into his yard, and looked at him, and said, "Those yours," and stayed, and came back when she hadn't needed to, and stood up in a room full of people and told the truth without being asked. Would you treat them with kindness? Who had ordered blue cloth in February, who had come out to this barn at 3 in the morning because she'd heard the mare and understood what the sound meant. He said, "You came back." It was not what he'd planned to say. It was what was there. She looked at him with the full version of herself, the one that didn't hold anything in reserve. "Of course I did." Then, because she was Maren and even the largest moments in her experience didn't entirely displace her particular kind of dry accuracy. "You had 3 items on a list that needed doing." He laughed, the real kind, unplanned, arriving before he could prepare for it. She smiled, the complete version, and the barn held it for a moment in its warmth. The November morning was ordinary in its beginning, the stove already burning when Caleb came to the kitchen, because Maren had been up first, as she almost always was, the coffee standing hot on the back of the stove. But she was at the table when he came in rather than already in the barn, which was unusual, and she was holding her cup in both hands and looking at the window with the look of someone who has been thinking carefully about how to say a specific thing. He sat across from her and poured his coffee and waited, because with her, waiting was always the right response. She looked at him. "May," she said. "Dr. Fenwick at Coldwater says May." Caleb put the cup down. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He looked at her face in the gray November morning light, the steadiness of it, the particular quality of someone who has already looked at a new thing from every direction and arrived at a position of clear openness rather than fear, the quality that was simply and essentially her. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "When the foals are standing on their own," he said. She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved, and then her whole face moved with it. "Our child," she said, "will stand faster than any foal on this property. Would you treat them with kindness?" He laughed and she laughed, and outside the kitchen window the horses in the south pasture moved through the early light of the November morning, unhurried in the good slow way of well-kept animals that have nowhere they need to be except where they are. That evening he sat at the desk alone, after Maren had gone to the room that was entirely hers now, her things beside his on the shelf above the wash basin, the east room transformed by occupation from a space he walked past into a room that was part of the house in a way it hadn't been in 15 years. He had the ledger open in front of him, and beside it the notepad page, with the 3 items in her handwriting, and beside that the folded receipt from Aldrich's office with Coyle's signature acknowledging the note satisfied in full. The lamp made its circle. Beyond it, the kitchen was in shadow. June's cup was on the right side of the table, where it had been for 15 years and where it would stay, because it meant what it meant, and what it meant was true, and the truth of it did not conflict with any other truth in this room. Some things could simply be true at the same time. He had learned this later than he should have, and not so late that it didn't matter. He was a man who had run a careful arithmetic of his remaining years and arrived at conclusions that had seemed to him like accuracy, and had in fact been something less than that. The accounting of a man so occupied with keeping the thing alive that he had lost the wider view of what the thing was and what it could still become. 3 items on a notepad, a tin of money under a floor in Missouri, a woman on a gray mule on a January morning who had asked one question and waited for the answer and then gone about her work. He closed the ledger. He looked at the 3 items in her handwriting. Outside, the Idaho night was total and cold, and the stars were the hard, clear stars of a November sky without moisture. In the south pasture, Cinder stood near the fence in the dark, the best thing on the property by every measure that mattered, the foundation of what the next 5 years would produce still here. Caleb turned down the lamp. The arithmetic, for the first time in a long time, worked out fine.